Angels Care Home Health, serving Hayes and the surrounding areas, is a Medicare-certified home health agency providing quality skilled nursing and restorative therapy services to patients in their homes.
I love the nurses that come and see me.
Angels Care is there to help 24 hours a day, and all services are covered 100% by Medicare for patients who are eligible.
Since I learned about Angel Care, I would recommend them to anybody.
Angels Care Home Health. We serve patients.
Eagle Community Television presents Community Connection with your host, Mike Cooper.
Hello and welcome again to Community Connection from Eagle Community Television. Thanks for watching. Thanks as always to the producer of our series and editor, Jeff Durall. We're at Albertson Hall on the campus of Fort Hays State University, third floor of Albertson Hall, the Biological Sciences area, with Dr. Brian Maricle, who is an associate professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at Fort Hays State University, and this year also assistant chair. As we visit with Dr. Maricle about a Science Cafe presentation, which he made back in February to the public. The Science Cafe, of course, sponsored by the Science and Mathematics Education Institute at Fort Hays State. Those events, by the way, are held at Gella's Diner, and they're free and open to the public, and held usually on a monthly basis. Well, Dr. Maricle presented a program on plant stressors and responses. So if you've ever grown plants, if you're a gardener, a homeowner, somebody who keeps the plants and responsible for those around the office, or a farmer, I think you're going to be interested in our Community Connection with Dr. Brian Maricle. Now in your, about 11th year here at Fort Hays State, Dr. Maricle?
Yes, 11 years.
What about your family? Tell us about the family.
So I grew up in Nebraska. I went to school in Kearney, Nebraska, and I grew up around a lot of plants. So my mom was a big gardener. She had lots of flower beds, and I grew up helping where I could with that, and I still do when I go home. So there's a lot of, I think, history with respect to my field of study.
So that initial work with your mom in the garden just kind of translated into a career then?
It kind of did. I wouldn't have guessed it at the time, but it ended up transforming me in some fashion.
Well, now your focus is on plant stressors and responses, but are there other areas of biological science that interest you, Dr. Maricle?
Yes, I'm interested in a lot of things. I think the primary interest is with plants and how they respond to the environment, but there's plenty of other things to do as well.
What about the family locally here?
I don't really have any family locally, so I just kind of work here.
Devoted to biological sciences
yes,
then, and
yes.
the department. Science Cafe, your topic was plant stressors and responses, plant growing conditions under stressful environments. Okay, let's start at the beginning here. What are the stressors? How do you identify those, Dr. Maricle?
So a stress can be explained as any condition that is less than optimal for plant growth. So rarely are conditions at optimum levels. There are, in most cases, it's too dry, or it's too hot, or it's too wet, or it's too something for plants to perform as well as they could. So any of those conditions is what I call a stress, and they're quite common. So in most cases, plants are stressed in some fashion, which will decrease how well they grow and how well they produce food for us.
And that's it, where your interest lies, is trying to determine how the plant responses to those stressors occur.
Yes.
Okay, so the stressors then can cover a wide range. And I was thinking, as you were telling me the description there, the only place that a plant would be comfortable, non-stressed, would be in a greenhouse effect, right? A man-made environment?
For the most part, yes, although there are even stresses there. And that's one of the things that I think is so interesting about plants, is that they are kind of rooted in one spot, right? Where their environment is constantly changing. It's rarely what we would consider to be a happy environment, so they have to deal with it right where they sit.
And there are also stresses like insects and other predators, things like that, right?
Yes, there are.
So what are the ranges of responses that plants make then, Dr. Maricle?
So a lot of their responses are either going to be structural or functional. So you might consider forming a more thick barrier between you and the environment as sort of a structural modification. So we're going to try to keep water in or try to keep insects out, so we have a thick barrier. There's also plenty of functional responses where they might make some adjustments to help take up water from dry soils, or might make some sort of chemical defenses if you have insects attacking you, something like that.
Which plants do on a regular basis, I guess. Huh?
Yes, they do.
I was thinking about the chemical responses that some plants that gardeners are familiar with that do repel insects to a certain extent, a natural response, I guess, to an attack or to a hostile environment.
Correct. So there are plants like tobacco comes to mind. The nicotine that's produced by tobacco is actually an insect toxin.
Well, now, I was thinking too, when you mentioned adapting, cacti, for example, taking up water and holding it, they adapt to their situations then.
They do, and that's a great example. Cacti are very, very good at adapting to a dry climate. So as you said, they can store water. They're a good example of forming a thick barrier to try to keep water in response to a dry climate. They have some special metabolic adaptations too to help conserve water in their dry climate.
Well, now, is this a process of evolving over time to respond to the stressors, since, as you said, plants are stationary, they don't move generally from place to place? Is that the way they do that?
Yes. So they evolve over time. So like the cactus example you just mentioned is a great case of many generations of plants that are gradually evolving to respond to this dry environment. But we also see some responses that are much shorter term, within the lifetime of a plant, where maybe we're going to just shed a few leaves so there's less surface area to evaporate water, or we might develop a slightly thicker waxy cuticle around the outside. So there are responses that can be much shorter term as well.
And this can occur in many different plants then over a shorter period of time.
Yes. Some plants will be much better than others at responding to an environment, but yes. And
those are the plants that'll survive, whereas the others, by the evolutionary process, are going to die out or wither.
Potentially. I guess it depends on where they are. So if they are adapted to growing in this particular setting, so you think of like a geographical location, here's this desert and this cactus, is it well adapted to that desert? If it is there, and if the climate stays the same there, then it should be okay.
Talk about the differences, if you would, Dr. Maricle, of those stressful environments, the environments that are natural as opposed to those that are man-made.
That's a great question. So there's lots of variation in environments that is natural. There's places that are wet, that are dry, that are salty, that are hot, that are cold, that are everything. And most of those places have plenty of plants that do just fine there. Now, the man-made environments, so we tend to change a lot of habitats. We plow things under. We make things into deserts if we deforest. So in some cases, we change climates. Oftentimes, something that is not optimal for what had evolved for those conditions. So like if you clear cut a forest, commonly you're going to see like drier conditions, and what used to be a shady forest then becomes a drier grassland. So very different conditions for plants that used to live there. In addition, there are conditions like say an oil spill or something, or other forms of pollution where there was now a very different set of conditions for whatever is growing there.
And plants may or may not be able to respond to these man-made environmental changes?
Correct. In some cases, the same responses that make them tolerant of natural stresses. In some cases, those help with the man-made stresses as well. But in some cases, not.
Especially, I would think, of oil spills or situations like even natural occurrences, hurricanes and things like that could destroy an area. Perhaps the plants can't respond quickly.
Correct. With something like an oil spill, I found that there's a lot of Oh, a lot of the plants that can tolerate flooded conditions can do well in an oil spill. There's actually some similar conditions that exist in flooded sediment compared to oil sediment, specifically a lack of oxygen. So if you have adaptations to live in the one, it usually works well in the other. Now, there are differences as well between an oil and flooded sediment, so it's not a perfect one-to-one relationship. So there's just a lot of correlations, I guess you would say.
I suppose you probably had a lot of time then to take a look at that huge BP oil spill back in the Louisiana Gulf and the relationship that it occurred with plants and the effects that it had.
Yes, and in fact, I had a student that was really interested in that, and she started working in my lab right after the oil spill event. And that's how we learned a little bit about this oil tolerance, is that there's these plants, again, that can tolerate the conditions in the sediment that come from oil. And that's an example of forming a barrier between you and your environment. If you can keep the oil out, then you are able to survive.
How did she do?
She did very well. She's currently in graduate school pursuing something similar.
Wow. So just that little spark brought a new student into biological sciences.
Yes.
That's terrific. Relate your work, if you would, on this issue, Dr. Maricle, to gardeners, to farmers, homeowners, people who keep office plants, those kind of things. How does this relate to practical day-to-day operation?
Oh, for those of us that have house plants, it might just be as simple as knowing that this plant prefers these conditions. And oftentimes you can look that kind of thing up, that this likes a lot of light or likes shade, or water it a lot, don't water it so much. So in some cases there can be some practical understanding with respect to keeping house plants. With the garden, I think you can extend that a little bit more, where you are involving the outdoors, where there are some unpredictable aspects to weather, especially in places like haze.
Much more changes outside.
Right, but a lot of the same kinds of concepts where, okay, this is too dry for these plants, or this is too much sunlight or not enough sunlight. So having some understanding of to how plants respond can help in growing a garden as well. And I think that, from a more practical standpoint, if we were to scale that up to, say, crop growers, there's our food supply being grown by farmers, and crop production is obviously important for us. We need to eat, so understanding how plants can make a living in these conditions. So, can we grow this particular crop species under these conditions is of obvious importance for all of us.
I'm thinking right now, our producer, Jeff Durall. Jeff, you're taking notes now on this for the house plants in the garden, I hope. Talk about climate change in our last couple of minutes, Dr. Maricle, about how that impacts as a plant stressor and the responses, would you?
So a lot of the models that predict climate change, there's some uncertainty, of course, but a lot of those models, at least for our part of the world, predict greater variability. So there's going to be more warm days, more extreme precipitation events, which also means that there's going to be potentially longer intervals between those precipitation events. So we can probably expect a lot of hot and dry spells in our part of the world. So understanding if plants can make a living in those new conditions will matter, both for maintaining our native rangelands as well as growing crop species. A lot of my recent studies are about drought and how drought affects plants, and we're studying one of the native species, one of the native prairie species around here, to try to figure out, okay, that these plants that are adapted to these drier conditions in comparison with plants that are from a wetter place, try to figure out how they do this, how they can maintain water uptake, how they can maintain photosynthesis to maintain a positive growth. And if we were going to apply some of that same knowledge to crop plants, okay, maybe we can figure out ways to make plants a little bit better able to live in these new sets of conditions that we are producing.
Which species are you working on?
Big blue stem.
Ah, okay.
So it's a dominant tall grass species. So we're kind of on the western edge of where it lives, which is interesting because it only grows so far west because of the because of the drier conditions as you go west.
And that, of course, obviously vitally important to the prairie ecosystem then.
Yes, yes it is. So in a tall grass prairie setting, big bluestem might be 70 or 80% of the biomass. So anything that grazes on prairie, you can think of like the big bison-sized herbivores, obviously. It's important if you're grazing cattle on prairie. Big bluestem is important there as well.
And even cover for smaller species, birds and other small animals.
The entire prairie community is going to rely on this foundation that's put in place by the plants that live there.
Wow. Fascinating research, Dr. Maricle. Thanks for sharing your expertise with us.
Thanks for having me.
The Associate Professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at Fort Hays State University is Dr. Brian Maricle, our Community Connection.
Angels Care Home Health, serving Hays and the surrounding areas, is a Medicare-certified home health agency providing quality skilled nursing and restorative therapy services to patients in their homes.
My Angel Care physical therapist taught me how to do exercises safely.
Angels Care is there to help 24 hours a day, and all services are covered 100% by Medicare for patients who are eligible.
It gives us independence in our home.
Angels Care Home Health. We serve patients.